I guess you've had the opportunity to be questioned not only by the only PhD mathematician, but also the only PhD physicist in the U.S. Congress. So I won't go too deeply into the nuts and bolts of quantum computing in the interest of time. But I guess my question is probably mostly for Mr. Wright. Digital contracts seem like they're really an area where this could be transformative. And it seems to me there are two classes of these. One where you need a governing body that can break the contracts under some circumstances, and one where you're comfortable just letting the digital process play out. And I was wondering if you've thought about the classes of problems that can be solved by those two.
Sure. Thank you for the question. One of the emerging use cases for blockchain technology is to memorialize parts of legal agreements in code, in software. So instead of having a natural language agreement, you would have all or portions of that agreement memorialized in some sort of software-based system. Smart contracts are unique, particularly on public blockchains, in their ability to run autonomously across a number of different computers at the same time. So that means you could potentially preclude them from terminating at some point in time. But at the same time, they're software, so you can program them in different ways, including ways to halt or terminate them. The real fundamental value for these smart contracts when it comes to legal arrangements is that blockchains have proven, at least in the public setting, to be pretty exemplary and exceptional in securing digital assets of different various stripes, including virtual currencies and representations of physical and or other digital assets. And you can use these programs to seamlessly transfer them. So for example, in the project that I mentioned that I'm working on called Open Law, we were able to model out an employee offer letter. In the employee offer letter, instead of it articulated a payment schedule, and instead of getting paid every 2 weeks, you could get paid every minute, right? And we can plug into that a smart contract that could actually remit tax payments automatically, assuming that the government was willing to accept tax payments in virtual currency. And that obviously is a proof of concept, but I think it points to a future where our commercial relationships are much more dynamic, and it represents a really new frontier for how we think about commercial arrangements.
Yeah, and yet if you found that the employee made fraudulent presentations in their application for the job, you need something like a court that has to go back and be able to digitally break this digital contract so the payments don't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the consensus is emerging that we'll have agreements that are written in natural language that only reference these smart contract programs, and of course courts would be able to administer them if there's a dispute. And on top of that, there'll be technical safeguards that would be put in place so that the parties could terminate the performance obligation during the course of performance.
Okay, so these sound like quite complex things, even to accomplish something simple.
Yeah, I think they're complex, but over time they should simplify and then could have a broad range of impact.
Yeah, or perhaps standardize, remain complex, but have the standardized boilerplate and a small amount of customized. But it's fascinating. Let's see, there are a couple of near-term things. Land registries using blockchain are being pursued by a handful of countries that I'm familiar with. And several countries are talking about issuing fiat currencies. So these are not like Bitcoin, where it just floats and has no intrinsic value. This would be something where the government treasury would guarantee to accept them for payment in taxes, or give you a real cash dollar back. And so that they wouldn't, they'd be solid. And I was wondering what are the near-term status of either of those, or whoever is most familiar with land registry efforts, for example? Mr.
This is a great question. So the idea here, again, is to record information related to title to property or deeds to property on a blockchain. In the U.S., obviously, the land title recordation system is quite fractured, so it would require a lot of coordination between various different state and county level officials in order to build these types of systems. But that's the promise. The promise is we can begin to record evidence of ownership on a blockchain and potentially develop a set of technologies that could become standardized not just here, but across the globe. So imagine a possibility of actually being able to transfer property regardless of jurisdictional boundaries. In much the same way when it comes to digital fiat currencies or digitized fiat currencies, there's been a number of efforts in order to explore this plane. There's been efforts by Singapore. I think recently there was an effort announced by Israel.
So they're actually functioning fiat currencies?
I think it's in the proof of concept stage, but the thought is to represent traditional fiat currency in a digitized form and to replicate some of the innovations that we've seen with cryptocurrencies.
In terms of the supply chain application, it seems like the big beneficiary may be offshore places where the supply chain is sort of shaky, and that we currently have a competitive advantage in the U.S. is that we have, you know, USDA and so on monitoring the ag supply chain. And I was wondering if that's something that you'd agree with or think that.
I think there's opportunities in very developed supply chains. We see food safety scares happening in very developed nations, and so the benefits there apply. We know that very small tweaks or improvements in supply chains result in big benefits, and so we think the idea of a digitized food system coupled with artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things will allow us to run smarter, more efficient supply chains. So I think the benefits are for the entire, the food system is global in nature. I think the entire food system can benefit.
All right, thank you, and yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. We've got a couple of members that want to follow-up questions, so we're going to be concise. We've got limited time. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jacques,